Everything you've been taught about how reality works is a lie. Not because someone deliberately deceived you, but because the entire system you grew up in was built on a fundamentally broken understanding of how possibility actually operates. And today, that changes. Most people live their lives in constant forward motion. They set goals, they make plans, they work on themselves, they visualize, they affirm, they push. Step by step, brick by brick. And there's one detail in this approach that destroys everything from the very start. Because every time you move towards something, you're automatically confirming you don't have it. Every effort, every desire, every reach, they all transmit the same signal into the field. This isn't here yet. And the field, which works like a perfect mirror, reflects exactly that back to you. Over and over, without exception. Think about it. When you say, "I want to be free," what are you actually saying? You're saying freedom is something you don't have right now. When you visualize your dream life as something you're moving toward, you're energetically locking in the idea that this life exists somewhere out there in the future. Not here. Not now. The very act of wanting creates a signature of absence. And that signature is the only thing reality picks up from you and reflects back. This is exactly why people practice visualization and affirmations for years and keep hitting the same wall. Not because the techniques are bad, because they're being used from the wrong place, from a place of lack, from a place of reaching for something that isn't here yet. And until you change the place you're operating from, nothing will change. No matter how many techniques you stack on top. But here's what changes everything. Reality doesn't get built forward. It unfolds backward. This isn't a metaphor. It's not a pretty phrase. It's not a spiritual concept. This is a principle that operates at the level of physics, at the level of how space itself is structured. The quantum field doesn't recognize linear time. For the field, past, present, and future exist simultaneously, which means every version of your life, from the most ordinary to the most extraordinary, already exists as a finished, living, complete reality. Right now, not someday. Now. You don't create your future. You select it from an infinite archive of realities that already exist. And what you select isn't determined by your actions or your desires. It's determined by what you perceive as real right now. What feels real to you? What feels like yours? What feels like it already lives inside you? And when you actually understand this, not with your mind, but with something deeper, something inside stops bracing. That constant background hum of try harder, want better, do more starts to fade because you begin to feel it. What you're looking for is already here. It's not somewhere else. It's right here, in the field of possibility, waiting not for your effort, but for your choice. Next, I'll show you exactly how this works, how to make this choice not in your head, but for real, and why most people, even after hearing this principle, stay exactly where they are. There's one moment that breaks almost everyone, and if you don't see it, the rest of this is just pretty theory. Most people, after hearing all this, do the exact same thing. They think, got it. I'll just pretend it's already here. I'll tell myself I'm already free, already wealthy, already living the life I want. And it sounds logical. But this is where almost everyone goes off the rails. Because pretending isn't embodiment. These are two completely different states, and the field never confuses them. When you're pretending, there's always a subtle knowing inside that says, this isn't real. A small voice that knows you're playing a part. And that voice, that internal mismatch, is the actual signal getting transmitted. Not your words, not your actions, not what you say out loud. The internal feeling of what's actually true for you. That's what the field reflects. This is why hope is a form of not knowing. This is why even desire dressed up in pretty words like, "I already have it," is still desire. Because behind the words is a state, and state outranks words. Always. A real shift requires one thing: completely closing the gap between you and what you're choosing, not shortening the distance, not building a bridge across it, erasing the very idea of distance. Because when there's no gap, there's no path. When there's no path, there's only arrival. And from that state, reality starts moving toward you, not because you're pulling it, because you're already there, where it is. Here's an analogy that makes this crystal clear. Imagine you're reading a mystery novel, but instead of starting on page 1, you flip to the last page first. You read how it ends. You know who did it. You know how it all resolves. Now you go back to page 1 and start reading. Everything changes. Every detail, every line of dialogue, every random event suddenly carries meaning. You're not guessing what happens. You're watching what you already know unfold. That's how reverse manifestation works. When you start from the point of "it's already done," every present moment automatically rearranges itself around that conclusion. Opportunities show up like they appeared on their own. The right people land in your path exactly when you need them. Resources move, without that exhausting feeling of dragging them by force. Not because you're doing anything special, because this is the natural logic of a reality that's already happened, and that you're already inside of. And here's what's most important about this state. It dissolves anxiety completely. The urgency disappears. The pressure to rush, to force, to prove to the universe that you're serious, gone. Because when you know how the story ends, you let it unfold without strain, without forcing, with the calm certainty of someone who already knows what's coming. This is why people who've mastered this principle look so strangely peaceful. They don't push. They don't worry about timing. They don't seek confirmation. They live from a place of completion. And this state isn't luck. It isn't a gift. It's a choice, a specific, conscious, repeatable choice. And next, I'll show you how to make it. Step by step. No filler. There's one thing every single person does when they first hear this principle, and it's the one thing that guarantees they stay exactly where they are. They start using this understanding as another technique. They think, okay, now I have a smarter tool. Now I'll do the same thing I was doing before, just with a new name. And right there, the whole thing falls apart. Because this isn't a technique, it isn't a method, it isn't another way to get what you want. This is a fundamentally different relationship with how reality works. And as long as you're treating it like a tool for achievement, you're still operating from the same logic of lack, just in nicer packaging. Here's what's actually happening at the quantum level. Every time you observe something, you don't just notice it. You participate in creating it. The observer affects the observed. This isn't philosophy. This is documented physics. And it leads to one critical implication. Where you're observing from determines what you see. If you observe your life from a place of lack, you're literally participating in creating lack. If you observe it from a place of completion, you're participating in creating completion. Not metaphorically, literally. And this is where most people make the next mistake. They try to change what they're observing without changing the place they're observing from. They add affirmations. They add visualizations, rituals, practices, but all of it stays glued on top of the same internal state, the same feeling that something is missing. And the field reads that state, not the words, not the actions on top of it. Your vantage point isn't a place in space. It's a state of consciousness. It's what you perceive as real right now, at the level of feeling, not thought. And you don't change it through effort. You don't change it by convincing yourself. You change it by selecting which reality you're going to perceive as real, not future, not desired, real. This is where the first practical step begins. Imagine a vast, living archive. Not abstract, tangible, real. Present right here, right now. Inside this archive, every version of your life exists at once. The version where you wake up feeling completely free. The version where you have everything you need and more. The version where you're living in exact alignment with why you came here. These versions don't exist as future possibilities. They exist as finished, living, complete realities. Right now, your job inside this archive isn't to build a new version. It isn't to earn access to a better one. It's to simply select the one that's already here. That shift from creating to selecting changes everything. Because when you build, you're starting from the assumption that it isn't here yet. When you select, you're starting from the assumption that it already is. And all you have to do is align with it. And here's what happens in the moment of a real selection. Not mental agreement, an actual internal switch. Your body starts responding differently. Your breath shifts. The space around you feels like it slightly rearranges. This isn't imagination. It isn't self-suggestion. It's a physical response to a change in your vantage point. Your consciousness just switched from one reality to another. But selecting once isn't enough. And this is exactly where most people decide it isn't working, when in reality, they just don't understand the next step. It's simpler than it sounds, but it requires something most people aren't willing to give. Here's what nobody tells you about step 2. Embodiment isn't a performance. It isn't behavior for an audience. It isn't trying to look fine when something inside is clenching. Because the field doesn't see your behavior. It reads your internal state. What's happening in the silence? When nobody's watching and you don't have to perform. Real embodiment is a shift in who you perceive yourself to be. Not who you want to become. Who you already are, right now. And the gap between these two things is the gap between someone who stays stuck and someone whose reality starts moving. Ask yourself right now, how does the person who's already living the reality you selected actually think? Not what do they do? How do they think? What's obvious to them? What goes without saying? What's the internal background tone of their morning? When something gets in their way, they don't ask, why is this happening to me? They ask, how does this fit into what's already happening in my favor? This isn't optimism. It's a different vantage point, locked in as habit. Now, the third step, which isn't really a separate step, it's the thing that holds everything together. Consistency. One switch isn't enough. Not because it doesn't work, because old patterns don't disappear after one experience. They dissolve through repetition of the new. Every time you return to the state of your selected reality, the connection to it gets stronger. Every time you think like the person from that reality, that way of thinking becomes more natural. And here's what eventually happens. That vantage point stops being something you consciously choose every time. It becomes the default place you're looking out from. That's the moment physical reality starts rearranging for real. Not because you did something, not because you earned it. Because the field is finally getting a stable, continuous signal it can match. But there's one moment that destroys consistency for most people. External reality starts testing how serious you are. And it does it in a very specific way. Most people read this as a sign that nothing's working, when in reality, it's the opposite. When reality starts testing you, here's what most people do. They start doubting, maybe this isn't working, maybe I'm doing something wrong, maybe this isn't for me. And in that exact moment, they tear down with their own hands what was just starting to build. Here's what's actually happening when external circumstances start pushing back. This isn't a sign you're on the wrong path. It isn't a signal to change your approach. It's information, very specific, very precise information about where there's still a mismatch between the reality you selected and the state you're transmitting by default. Think of it as calibration. The field isn't punishing you. It's showing you, with absolute precision, where your vantage point hasn't fully locked in, where your words say one thing, but your state says another, where the language is ahead of the feeling. This isn't a problem. This is exactly what you work with. The right response to this moment isn't panic. It isn't forcing. It isn't rushing to fix something out in the world. The right response is return. Return to the state of embodiment. Quietly, calmly, without drama. Just go back to that internal place where you observe reality as already done, and stay there until it locks in again. There's a specific practice that lets you do this in any moment. I call it memory of the future. Here's how it works. In the moment when the external is pulling you back to the old vantage point, you make one move. You shift not to a thought about the future, but to the feeling of something already done. Not the image of what you want, the bodily, alive, physically tangible sense of the reality you've already selected. These are different things, and the difference is enormous. The image of what you want holds you in a future where it isn't here yet. The feeling of it already done moves you into a state where it already is. And the field responds to state, not to the image. Try it right now. Remember a moment in your life when you felt something close to what you're reaching for. Not necessarily the same form, similar in feeling. Freedom, lightness, fullness, confidence. Find that feeling in your body. Where does it live? How does it sound? What does it feel like from the inside? Now amplify it. Let it expand. Don't think about it. Live in it. Right now. That's your anchor of clarity. A specific, physically tangible state you can return to in any moment, no matter what's happening on the outside. This isn't a technique for avoiding reality. It's a tool for holding your vantage point when something external is trying to move it. Now, about gratitude. Not as a ritual, not as some law of attraction practice for pulling in good things. As a state that directly reveals where you're observing from. There are two completely different kinds of gratitude, and most people are using the wrong one. The first kind is gratitude for what's coming, for what you hope to receive, for what isn't here yet, but you're saying thank you in advance. It sounds spiritual, it sounds right, but it actually keeps you locked in the same place of lack, because the structure of that gratitude says, it isn't here yet, but I'm waiting. The second kind is gratitude for what already is, not for what's going to appear, for what is already present in the reality you've selected as real. This is the state of someone who already has it, not waiting, not hoping, living inside of it as fact. And that's the state that creates resonance with your selected reality. The difference in feeling is subtle, but the difference in the signal you're transmitting is enormous. And once you can tell these two states apart from the inside, you have a precise internal compass, one that tells you in any moment, am I observing from completion or from waiting? But there's something that destroys even the most stable vantage point, even the strongest anchor, even the deepest gratitude. And it doesn't happen on the outside. It happens inside, in the place where beliefs live, beliefs you might not even know you have. Beliefs don't work the way most people think. People think a belief is a thought, that if you remove the thought or replace it with another one, the belief is gone. But a belief isn't a thought. It's a state in which a particular picture of reality feels obvious and self-evident, beyond question. That's why you can't handle it through thinking. When somewhere inside you there lives a belief that you're not enough for the reality you selected, that belief doesn't block you directly. It does something much more subtle. It distorts the clarity of the signal you're transmitting. You can say all the right words, do all the right practices, return to your anchor. And somewhere in the background, a quiet signal of mismatch keeps playing. The field reads that. This is why fighting limiting beliefs almost never works. When you fight a belief, you amplify your attention on it. You make it more real, more present in your vantage point. The harder you push, the louder it gets. The way out is fundamentally different. You don't remove the belief. You embody the version of you who doesn't have it. That version of you in your selected reality has long outgrown those limits. They aren't relevant to her. They aren't even on her radar. And when you actually embody her consciousness, when you start thinking and perceiving the world the way she does, her beliefs automatically become yours. Not because you convinced yourself, because you switch to a vantage point where those beliefs simply don't exist. This is one of the most important principles in this entire process. Identity determines reality, not the other way around. Most people are waiting for external circumstances to shift first, for evidence to appear, for events to happen, and then they'll finally let themselves feel different. Then their identity will change, their self-perception, their internal state. But that's backwards. That's waiting for permission from reality to start being yourself. The reverse path works the other way. You change first. You don't wait for evidence. You don't wait for confirmation. You just start being the version of yourself who's already living the selected reality. From the inside, in how you think, in what you perceive, in what's obvious to you. And reality follows. Because reality has no other option but to reflect the state you're transmitting. But here's what happens when someone starts actually doing this. The people around them start reacting. Sometimes it looks like support. Sometimes it looks like the opposite. And how you handle that second case determines everything. Because this is where most people back off at the last moment. The most dangerous moment in this whole process isn't when things are bad. The most dangerous moment is when things start changing. Because that's when your environment starts reacting to your shift. And the reactions come in two forms. Form 1, people start gravitating toward you. Form 2, people start resisting you. And if you don't understand why the second one happens, you might mistake it for a sign you're going the wrong way. When you change your vantage point, when you start embodying a different version of yourself, you automatically change the field of how you interact with people. The ones who got used to your old version, how you used to react, think, decide, suddenly find that version isn't there anymore. And that creates discomfort for them. Not because they wish you ill, because one person changing inside a system requires the entire system to shift. And systems don't like to shift. It can show up as skepticism, as attempts to talk you back into the old version, as quiet disagreement or open pushback. And if you start defending yourself in this moment, explaining, proving, justifying your shift, you make one critical mistake. You step out of embodiment, and you step into defense. Defense is always a reaction to threat, and only someone unsure of where they stand feels threatened. Someone genuinely anchored in their vantage point doesn't defend. They don't have to prove anything. They just keep being who they are, calmly, without strain, without needing anyone's approval. And that calm, that internal stillness, ends up affecting the environment far more than any explanation ever could. There's an observation that describes precisely what happens to people who've internalized this principle. People start describing them as having a different energy. There's something easier about being around him. She just sees things differently. I don't know what it is, but I want to be around him. They can't name what they're feeling. They just feel a pull. And it isn't random. It's the direct result of a stable, whole, consistent vantage point. Wholeness is magnetic. Not because that sounds nice, because most people are living inside internal contradiction. One part wants something, another part is afraid, a third part is doubting. And when they meet someone whose entire inside is pointing in the same direction, they feel it physically. Like meeting something solid, in a world where almost everything is wobbling. But here's what's important to understand about that magnetism. It isn't the goal. It's a side effect. The moment you start working for the effect, the moment magnetism becomes the thing you're holding the state for, you're back inside the logic of wanting, the logic of getting something from outside. And the signal distorts again. The only goal is being in the state of completion, because that's the truth about the reality you selected, not for the effect, not for the magnetism, not to make an impression, but because you selected this reality and you live from it as fact. Everything else shows up on its own. And now the most important question, the one you probably already have. How do you hold this state when the world around you is broadcasting the exact opposite? When the news says one thing, when the economy says another, when the people next to you are carrying their fears and their doubts? How do you stay inside when everything outside is pushing the other way? The answer to this isn't just the next step. It's what separates people for whom this works always from people for whom it only works on good days. 90% of people who start working with this principle only do it when things are already going well, when they have the resources, the mood, the energy. And that's exactly what makes the whole thing unstable. Because on good days, holding the state of completion is easy. The test comes on the other days. And the other days are where it gets decided whether this actually works for you. Most people are what you could call energetic sponges. They absorb the state of whatever is around them. Walk into a room that's anxious, they get anxious. Watch the news, they feel uneasy. Talk to someone in fear, the fear transfers. This doesn't happen because they're weak. It happens because they haven't built an internal source of clarity. They don't have something that generates state from the inside, regardless of what's outside. Sovereignty is exactly that. The ability to generate your state from the inside, instead of absorbing it from outside. This isn't isolating from the world. It isn't being indifferent to people. It's a fundamentally different direction of flow. Instead of the world setting your state starts affecting the world, not through effort, not through trying to change anyone, just through presence, through what you transmit by being there. And here's where there's a concrete practice that makes this possible. Remember the anchor of clarity from earlier? That specific bodily feeling tied to your selected reality? That's the tool. That's what lets you restore your internal source in any moment, regardless of what's happening outside. You can be in the most charged situation and return to your state in seconds by activating that anchor. But this only works if the anchor is deep enough, if it's tied to a feeling, not an image, to a living, bodily, physically present sense of a reality already done. That's why it's important to return to it not only in hard moments, but in calm ones too. Every return makes the connection deeper, faster, more reliable in any situation. There's another piece of sovereignty almost nobody talks about openly. It's the ability to stay open to people without absorbing their state. You can be fully present in a conversation with someone carrying fear or anxiety. You can hear them, feel them, support them, and not take their state on as your own. Stay anchored in your own vantage point. This isn't coldness. It's maturity. It's the difference between empathizing and dissolving. And here's what starts happening when you reach this level of stability. Economic shifts stop determining your sense of possibility. Other people's fears stop activating yours. Collective moods stop being the thing that decides how you feel. Not because you closed yourself off from the world, because your source became internal. And that opens up something that changes how you understand what you actually are. Most people never realize this about themselves. Not because it's complicated, because it's so simple. The mind refuses to believe it. Everything we've talked about so far has been built on one assumption, that there's you and there's reality, that there's an observer and the thing being observed, that there's a person selecting a reality and the reality being selected. This assumption works as a practical tool. It lets us describe the mechanics, walk through the steps, give actual practices. But at the deepest level, this assumption isn't true. You aren't a separate observer looking at reality from outside. You're part of the same fabric reality is woven from. Consciousness isn't located inside you like a tool. You're located inside consciousness, as a form of its expression. This isn't abstract. This changes everything about how you experience this whole process. When a person believes they're separate, that they're trying to influence the field through their actions and states, they're inevitably operating from effort, subtle effort. Effort dressed up as embodiment and selection, but still effort. Because a separate being is always, in some way, trying to get something from outside. There's always the one who wants, and the thing they want. But when you understand that you are the field, that the consciousness expressing itself through you is the very force that creates reality, the entire logic of effort collapses. Because who's reaching toward what? Where are you going if you're already there? What are you receiving if you're already the source? This is the moment the whole process stops being a practice. It's not self-improvement anymore. It's not skill building. It's recognition. You're not becoming someone new. You're remembering who you've always been. You're not creating access to a new reality. You're recognizing in yourself what was always yours. And here's what happens when this recognition becomes alive. Instead of just understood by the mind, the background tension dissolves. That quiet, chronic feeling that you need to be doing something, finishing something, achieving something, proving something, gone. Not because you stop moving or acting, because action is no longer coming from a sense of lack. It's coming from fullness, from interest, from the joy of expression, not from the fear of being left with nothing. This is a fundamentally different quality of life. And people who've touched it, even briefly, describe it the same way. Everything got lighter. I stopped fighting. I don't know how to explain it, but something changed inside, and outside everything started arranging itself differently. They can't name exactly what happened, but the feeling stays. The feeling that they came back to somewhere they'd left a long time ago. This return doesn't happen through the right technique. It doesn't show up as a reward for long enough practice. It happens in the moment you stop searching for it outside, when you stop in silence, and you let yourself simply be, without trying to become, without reaching to arrive, without waiting for confirmation. Just here, just now, just this. And from this place, from this internal silence, everything else unfolds naturally. Not because you did everything right, because you remembered. Who's doing it? There's one question that always comes up for anyone who really sits with this principle. If I'm already what I'm looking for, if the reality is already selected, if the source is internal, then why do anything at all? It's one of the sharpest questions you can ask, because the answer to it makes everything else clear. Action doesn't disappear. It changes nature. When a person acts from a sense of lack, every action carries the tension of trying to get there. It's colored with anxiety. What if it doesn't work? It's aimed at reaching something that isn't here yet. And even when it looks like confidence on the outside, somewhere inside there's always that quiet question. Am I doing enough? When action comes from fullness, from the reality you've already selected, from the state of someone for whom this is already normal, its nature changes completely. It becomes expression, not pursuit. It's the difference between an artist who paints because there's something inside that needs to come out, and an artist who paints because they're afraid of not being recognized. From the outside, they're both holding a brush, but what's happening inside and what actually gets created, those are two completely different worlds. And here's what's practically important to understand about action from fullness. It doesn't require constant monitoring of the result. A person acting from lack is constantly checking. Is this working? Are there signs yet? Is it moving in the right direction? Every check is an exit from embodiment and a return to waiting. And waiting, like we said, transmits one thing. It isn't here yet. Action from fullness unfolds without that checking. Not because you don't care, because you're not waiting for confirmation. You already know how the story ends. You just let it unfold. You take the next step not because it gets you closer to a goal, but because it's the natural next move of someone already living in this reality. This sounds subtle, but in practice, it feels very specific. Some actions come from fear of missing out. Some come from wanting to prove something. Some come from anxiety about the future. And some just happen as a natural extension of who you are right now. The last kind are the only ones that create movement in the right direction, without burning you out from the inside. There's one more piece that makes all of this genuinely sustainable over time. It isn't a technique. It isn't a practice. It's an understanding that, once it actually lands inside you, changes how you experience every moment of your life. It has to do with how you relate to your desires, not how you fulfill them, what they actually are. Because most people have it completely wrong. And that's exactly what makes desires a source of suffering, instead of a source of movement. Your desires are not what you think they are. This isn't a pretty phrase. This literally changes everything if you actually get it. Most people read their desire as a signal of lack. I want money means I don't have it. I want freedom means I'm trapped. I want peace means inside it's chaos. Desire gets read as a pointer to what's missing, and that's exactly why it becomes a source of suffering. Because every desire, in this logic, is a reminder of what you don't have right now. But desire isn't a signal of lack. Desire is a signal of presence. You can't want something you have no internal knowing of. You can't reach for freedom if there's no flicker of freedom already inside you. The desire itself arises out of contact with something already present in you. Not outside, not in the future. Inside. This means something important. When a desire shows up in you, it isn't saying, you don't have this. It's saying, this is already part of you. This is where your nature is already pointing. This is the reality already living inside you as potential, ready to become real. Which is why desires don't need to be suppressed. You don't need to fight them. You don't need to be ashamed of them. They aren't a problem. They're a compass. A precise, living, accurate compass that always points to what is already yours by nature. Your job isn't to earn what it points to. Your job is to recognize yourself in it. And here's where the quietest, deepest shift in everything we've talked about happens. When you stop reading desire as need and start reading it as recognition, all the internal tension around it dissolves. Not because the desire is gone, because it stopped being proof of lack, and it became something else. An invitation, a pointer to what is already here, already yours, already real. Try it right now. Take one desire that's been with you for a long time. Don't think about how to make it happen. Just ask yourself, what is this desire telling me about who I already am? What is it pointing to as something already present in me? As nature, not as lack? And watch what happens inside when you look at it from this angle. Most likely you'll feel something close to relief, subtle, but real, like something inside stops clenching. That's the moment of recognition, the moment desire stops being a weight and becomes confirmation. Confirmation of who you already are, not of what's missing. When this understanding becomes alive in everyday experience, your relationship with reality shifts at the cellular level. Not as an idea, not as a concept, as an actual feeling that's there in the background in any moment. The feeling that you're already where you need to be, that nothing is lost, that every desire is not a cry for help, but a quiet reminder of who you are. And that's the foundation everything else rests on, without effort. Not techniques, not practices, not steps, just this living, quiet, stable knowing inside. That's what makes everything we've talked about, not a set of tools, but a way of being. But there's one more dimension most people completely miss, a dimension that reaches beyond the personal, And it changes not just how you live your life, but what happens to the people around you. Something happens to you when you live from this place long enough, and almost nobody talks about it openly. You start affecting the reality of other people, not through words, not through advice, not through trying to change them, through your presence. This isn't mystical. It's the direct consequence of what we talked about in sovereignty. When your internal source is stable, when you're not absorbing the state of your environment but transmitting your own, you become what you could call a point of stability. And people feel it, not always consciously, but always physically. Have you noticed that around some people, it's just easier to think? That in their presence, there seems to be more room? That a conversation with them leaves you feeling like you've become a little more yourself? That isn't an accident. It isn't a special gift. It's the result of a stable, whole, consistent internal point. Someone living from fullness creates a field around them, where it's easier for other people to remember their own fullness. And here's what's important about this influence. It isn't the goal. You can't consciously try to influence others this way. The moment you start doing it on purpose, you exit fullness and enter management. And management is always about lack, about trying to make sure things are right, about fear that if you don't intervene, something will go wrong. Influence from fullness happens by itself. You're just present. You're just being who you are. And that presence works without effort, without intention, without trying to change anyone or anything. Simply as a natural consequence of where your vantage point is, which is why one person's transformation is never just about them. Anyone who's actually internalized the reverse principle of how reality works, who lives from recognition instead of lack, who acts from fullness instead of fear, is doing something important for everyone around them. They're reminding people, by their existence, that this is possible, not through words, not through examples, through the simple fact of being there. This sounds big, but in practice, it looks very simple. It looks like a person who doesn't panic when everything around them is unstable, who doesn't catch other people's fear, who finds possibility where others only see obstacles, who stays themselves regardless of circumstances, and who, at the same time, isn't closed off, isn't cold, isn't indifferent. They're just stable, just whole, just here. But everything we've talked about so far only matters if there's one thing in place, one thing without which everything else stays beautiful theory. And most people either don't know about it, or they know about it, but they don't realize how critical it is. The one thing without which none of this works isn't a technique. It isn't a practice. It isn't willpower. It's something most people take for granted, but almost nobody actually does. It's honesty with yourself about where you're actually observing from right now. Not where you wish you were observing from, not where you think you're observing from, where you're actually observing from in this very second. And this requires something specific. It requires regular pauses for an honest internal audit, not to criticize yourself, not to find what you're doing wrong, but to get accurate information about the real signal you're transmitting right now. Most people live in a gap between what they think about themselves and what's actually happening inside. They think, I'm working on this, I'm embodying, I'm holding the state. But somewhere in the background, an old program is quietly playing, a quiet doubt, a familiar feeling that something is off. A background anxiety they've gotten so used to ignoring it feels normal. And that background signal is what gets transmitted. Not the words, not the intentions, that quiet hum. An honest internal audit is when you stop and ask yourself, very directly, what am I actually perceiving as real right now? Not what I want to perceive, not what I'm trying to perceive. What I actually perceive as real at the level of feeling, not thought. The desired reality or the familiar limitations? And there's always an answer, always precise, always honest, if you let yourself hear it. This isn't grounds for self-criticism. It's just data, very valuable, very accurate data about where your actual vantage point is in this moment. And once you see it clearly, you know what to do. You return, without drama, without judgment, without the feeling that something went wrong. Just quietly, calmly, you return to the state you chose to observe from. And it's that honesty that makes the whole process real, not pretty, not perfect, not flawless, real. Because a real process isn't one where it always works on the first try. It's one where you always know where you are, and you always know how to come back. And the more often you do this, the shorter the distance between leaving the state and returning to it gets. At first, it might take hours, then minutes, then seconds. Then you start catching the drift before it even lands. And at some point, you find yourself returning automatically, without conscious effort, just as the natural reaction of a system that knows where it belongs. That's what it means to live from this principle. Not applying it sometimes, not using it as a tool when you want something, but existing inside of it, like inside your own natural state, like inside who you are, not what you do. And here's what happens when this becomes your nature. Life stops feeling like a fight. Not because difficulties stop showing up. They show up, but they stop being read as obstacles. They start being read as part of an unfolding story, whose ending you already know. And that feeling, that quiet, stable knowing inside, is probably the most valuable thing this whole path opens up. But there's one final piece that ties everything together, about what actually happens when you live this for real, not as an idea, as a reality. When a person actually moves through all of this, when it becomes a living, everyday experience instead of a set of concepts, something happens that's impossible to describe in advance. You have to live it. But here's a way to point at it, so you'll recognize it when it shows up. You start noticing that life seems to be cooperating with you, not because you learned how to influence it correctly, because you stopped fighting it. You stopped trying to bend it to your expectations. You stopped demanding confirmation from it. And in that moment, it started reflecting what you are, not what you fear. It looks different for different people. For some, it shows up as opportunities appearing without any visible cause. For some, it's people landing in their life at exactly the right time. For some, it's decisions arriving by themselves without painful deliberation. The forms are different. The feeling is the same. The feeling that something larger than you is moving in the same direction with you. Not against you, not instead of you, with you. And here, the last and most important understanding of all of this lands. What's moving with you isn't an external force. It's not the universe as something separate from you. It's you. The part of you that always knew who you are, that always knew what was real for you. The part that was muffled for years by doubts, by fears, by other people's beliefs, by the habit of seeing yourself as someone who's missing something. When you start living from your selected reality as fact, when you embody the version of yourself who already has everything they need, when you hold your vantage point from completion instead of waiting, you're not creating something new. You're removing what was blocking you from seeing what was already there. You're peeling back layers, and under them is what was always there. Whole, real, alive. And that's where the reverse principle leads at its deepest. Not to getting something from outside, to coming back to yourself, to the version of yourself that was never broken, never not enough, never needed proof. The version that always knew it was already what it was looking for. The takeaway is simple. You were never on the path to yourself. You were always already yourself. The only thing that ever changed was how much you let yourself know it. Life isn't asking you to become someone else. It's just waiting for you to stop pretending, to be something smaller than you actually are. And now, one question. Right now, in this exact second, If you're being completely honest with yourself, are you living as a person who's already the one you want to be? Or as a person still waiting for permission from life to start being them? Answer it not for anyone else, for you. Because sometimes one honest answer to one precise question changes more than years of searching.